In the territory of New Mexico in the summer of 1887, a man named Harlan Greer stood on the steps of the Cobre Flats jailhouse and sold the building for $1. He had served as sheriff of Cobra Flats for 11 years. He had slept in the office attached to those 4 cells more nights than he could count, had eaten his supper at the desk beside the dispatch log, had repaired the iron hinges on the front door twice with his own hands. The jailhouse was not simply a building he administered. It was, by every practical measure, the place where he had lived. And on a Tuesday morning in July, he signed a bill of transfer, accepted a single Liberty coin from the buyer, pocketed it, and walked away down the dust of Main Street without looking back. The town watched him go. The people of Cobre Flats were not, as a rule, a sentimental population. They had seen men make bad bargains before, had seen droughts take farms and fever take families, had grown accustomed to the particular mathematics of loss that the frontier imposed. They had buried enough to know that what a man chose to give away was usually something he could no longer afford to keep. What they could not quite account for was Harlan Greer himself. He hadn't been in debt as far as anyone knew. He had not been drinking. He had not been run out or threatened. He had simply sold the thing and gone, and the town watched him diminish down the street the way it watched most things, with a full minute of attention and then a return to whatever had been at hand before. The buyer was a young woman from Socorro who arrived the following morning with a leather satchel, a folded paper record from the county land office, and no particular expression of triumph on her face. Her name was Nora Vane. She was 27 years old, and she had spent the last 4 of those years working as a clerk and document examiner for a land title attorney whose practice had dissolved when the attorney died of a stroke in the spring. She had been left with a methodical mind, a set of habits oriented toward the reading of recorded instruments, and very little money. She had learned those habits from the attorney, whose name was Gideon Pratt, and who had, in his prime, been one of the most careful readers of chain of title documents in the territory. He had taught her to read a deed the way a locksmith reads a lock, from the inside out, attending to every mechanism before drawing a conclusion about what had been secured and what had been left open. He had a phrase he returned to often, usually when she had skimmed past a clause or trusted a summary over the instrument itself. "Read what is written," he would say, "not what they meant to write." The two are frequently different things. She had found that true enough to keep as a working principle, and she had been keeping it for 4 years. Pratt had also taught her something about buildings, which was that a building is a legal instrument as much as it is a structure, and that what is inside a legal instrument is frequently not the same as what is printed on its face. He had showed her once in the Socorro recorder's office an old deed with an amendment attached in a different hand, written months after the original filing, and he had said that the amendment was almost always where the real information lived. The original instrument stated the terms everyone agreed to at the beginning. The amendment stated the terms someone had reason to revise later, and revision was almost always a sign that something had happened in between. She had first heard about the jailhouse sale from a clerk at the county recorder's office in Socorro, a man named Eli Soto, who processed documents and remembered everything he had processed. Eli was 70 years old and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from decades of attending to small printed things in a room where people rarely asked his opinion. He had told her about the sale without emphasis, the same way he told her about anything, and had added as a kind of footnote that the property was unusual in one respect. The original construction deed for the Cobre Flats jailhouse, filed in 1869, carried a covenant attached to Cell 4. He had a copy of it in the recorder files. He showed it to her and she read it standing at the counter, and then she read it again. The covenant named a specific party whose property had been used without compensation in the building of the original jail. The party was a man named Aurelio Vargas, a mason who had quarried and cut the stone block for 3 of the 4 cells and had been paid for the work on cells 1, 2, and 3. For cell 4, he had not been paid. The covenant, which appeared to have been added to the deed as an amendment in a different hand from the original filing, stated that the stone in cell 4 remained the property of Aurelio Vargas or his heirs until such time as the debt was settled. The debt named was $43. $43 had never been paid. She had stood at the county recorder's counter for a long moment after reading that. Eli Soto had watched her from the other side of the high desk, with the patience of a man who has learned that certain documents require a moment before the person reading them is ready to speak. "You see it," he said when she finally looked up. She had nodded. She had seen it clearly. The covenant was still live. The debt had never been discharged, and a jailhouse sold for $1 with an undischarged covenant attached to the title was a jailhouse that carried a $43 claim its new owner could either honor or dispute in a territory court for a decade. What she did not yet know was why Harlan Greer had sold it. If you have ever held a document and felt the weight of what it was not saying, you understand something of what Nora Vane felt standing at that county counter. There is a particular kind of silence in a legal instrument that has been filed and forgotten for 18 years. It is not the silence of nothing. It is the silence of something no one bothered to listen for. Leave a comment if you have ever found a piece of paper that changed what you thought you knew about something you had always taken for granted. She arrived in Cobra Flats carrying the deed, the covenant, and a second document she had located by following the chain of title backward another step. That second document was a land grant certificate filed in 1866, assigning a parcel of 40 acres on the western edge of what would become the town limits to one Aurelio Vargas, in recognition of 3 years of labor and material contribution to the construction of public buildings in the area, signed by the territorial governor's office. The land grant certificate had been revoked 2 years later in 1868 by a summary administrative proceeding in the county records on the basis of a sworn statement that Aurelio Vargas had abandoned the parcel and departed the territory. The sworn statement bore the signature of the man who had been Cobra Flats' first sheriff. Harlan Greer had been the second. She rode into town on a Thursday morning and stabled her horse at the livery on the eastern end of Main Street. The liveryman took her money and her horse and didn't otherwise acknowledge her, which suited her well enough. She was not yet ready to be known in Cobra Flats. She walked the main street from one end to the other first, the way Pratt had taught her to walk any town in which she was working, before she went to the property itself. She noted what was adjacent to what, which buildings were occupied, and which were not, where the county office had been and where it had moved. She counted the buildings and noted their materials. Several were adobe. Several were frame. The jailhouse at the north end of Main, 2 blocks from the livery, was stone. The jailhouse itself was a low, solid structure of brown-gray stone, set back from the main street behind a short post fence that had once been painted white and was now the color of old weather. She stood in front of it for a time the way she had been taught to stand in front of any building whose documents she was about to examine, quietly and without assumption, letting the structure itself offer information before she imposed a theory on it. The building was in reasonable repair. The roof had been patched recently, the windows were intact, and the front door showed signs of regular use in the wear of its step. What she noticed first, and kept noticing as she moved around the exterior, was the stonework. 3 sides of the building were finished in the same material, a rough-cut local sandstone the color of dried mustard, laid in courses of moderate regularity. The 4th side, the eastern wall, was something else. It was cut stone, finely dressed, each block facework to a smoothness the rest of the building did not approach, the joints close and even, the coursing nearly perfect. It was the work of someone who had cared deeply about what stone could be made to do, and it was better work by a considerable margin than anything on the other 3 walls. The mortar in those joints was original, and it had not cracked. She knew from the covenant which cell sat on the eastern wall. The front door was not locked. She went in. The interior held 4 rooms, the sheriff's office at the front, a short corridor, and 4 cells along the back, 2 on each side of the corridor. The cells were simple in their construction. Iron bar doors, a wood plank bunk fixed to the wall, a small high window cut through the stone. 3 of the cells showed the ordinary marks of long use, old initials scratched into the plaster above the bunks, rust in the bolt housings, the smell of accumulated years. The 4th cell was at the far end of the corridor on the east side. It was cleaner than the others. Not cleaned recently, but clean in the sense that it had not accumulated the same debris, had not been inhabited with the same regularity, had been left to itself in a way the other 3 had not. She stood at the barred door and looked in for a time. Then she unlocked it with the key on the ring she had been given at the bill of transfer. And she went to the eastern wall of that cell and placed her hand flat against the stone. The dressed stone was cold, as dressed stone always is, and smooth in a way that the rough-cut blocks of the other walls were not. She ran her hand along the first course above the floor, pressing her fingertips along each joint. They were tight, as the exterior had suggested, mortar set properly and aged. She did the same with the second course. She worked the 3rd course from left to right and found what she had been half expecting to find. A block in the middle section, roughly the size of a bread loaf set on its side, had a joint on its left edge that was not mortar. The material there was fitted but not bonded, pressed in rather than set, firm to the touch but hollow sounding when she struck it gently with her knuckle. Gideon Pratt had told her once that a mason who is owed money by the man he is working for will sometimes leave himself an insurance policy. A good stone man can set a block with no mortar and make it indistinguishable from the bonded courses around it if he dresses the faces carefully enough and the inspector does not probe the joints. The question, Pratt had said, is whether the block conceals something or simply marks the fact of an unpaid debt, and the stone cannot answer that. You have to pull it. She did not have a tool for that on her person. She had her satchel, which contained paper records, a folded cloth for her glasses, and a small clasp knife for opening correspondence. She used the spine of the knife in the filled joint, working it slowly and without force. The material in the joint was not mortar. It was packed clay, dried to near hardness over what the evidence of the deed suggested had been 18 years. And it came away in thin wedge-shaped pieces as she worked the knife spine around the edge of the block. She spent approximately 20 minutes on all 4 edges. When the clay was sufficiently cleared, she pressed both palms against the face of the block and pushed slowly inward. The block moved, not easily and not far, but it moved, rotating slightly inward on its bottom edge as though it had been set to pivot rather than slide. She pressed harder. The stone gave another fraction. She pressed again, and the block seated inward at an angle that left a triangular gap at its top edge. She worked her fingers into that gap, careful of the cut edges, and tilted the block upward and away from the wall until it came free of its course entirely and rested on the cell floor with a sound like a muffled drum strike. The cavity behind it was roughly the size of a hat box. It held dust and the smell of 18 years of sealed air, and a tin dispatch box painted black with a hasp clasp that carried no lock. She lifted the tin box out and set it on the cell floor and sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment. The box was light enough that she could tell there was not much inside it. She opened the hasp. Inside were 3 items. The first was a folded letter on paper that had yellowed at the edges. Written in a careful hand, she identified immediately as the same hand that had written the Covenant Amendment in the deed of 1866. The letter was addressed to no one in particular. It began by stating that if the letter was found after the writer's death, it should be known that the debt owed for the stone of Cell 4 was not an error but a deliberate choice made by the first sheriff of Cobray Flats, who had also made the choice to falsify the record of the writer's land grant and swear before the county clerk that the writer had departed the territory. The writer had set down this record before departing in truth, because the sheriff had made it clear that justice would not be forthcoming while he held office, and because the stone itself could not be carried. The letter continued for 2 more pages in the same careful hand. It named dates and amounts and named witnesses who had been present at both transactions. It closed with a single sentence that Nora read twice over. "The stone belongs to me, and Cell 4 belongs to me until someone pays what is owed. And if no one pays it, let the building stand on a debt, and let the man who built it be remembered for what he actually did." The second item in the tin box was a receipt, dated June of 1868, for $43. The payer's line was unsigned. The payee's line bore the signature of Aurelio Vargas, written in the same hand as the letter, as though he had prepared the receipt in full and left it waiting for a signature that never came. The third item was a deed of trust, written in the same hand as the letter, conveying the parcel of 40 acres to Aurelio Vargas's eldest child, named Rosa, in the event the land grant could be restored by legal process. Rosa Vargas, if she was living, and was the daughter of a man who had cut stone in New Mexico in 1866, would be in her middle 30s or early 40s. Nora refolded the letter with care, returned all 3 items to the tin box, closed the hasp, and placed the box in her satchel beside her other documents. She stood and dusted her knees and looked once more at the block of dressed stone resting on the cell floor. She left it where it lay. It had served its purpose. She took a room at the lodging house on the south end of Main Street, a clean and sparse room with a window that faced the back lot, where a stand of cottonwoods had grown up along a dry creek bed and stood in the last light looking pale and still. She set the tin box on the windowsill and her satchel on the bed, and washed her hands at the basin before sitting at the small table with her papers. She worked through the logic of what she had found, the way Pratt had taught her to work through a complex title, beginning with what she knew for certain and moving outward from there. She knew the covenant was live. She knew the $43 had never been paid. She knew the land grant had been revoked on the basis of a sworn statement, the letter now directly contradicted, and she had the letter, and the letter named specific dates and specific witnesses who had been present at both transactions. The question was whether any of the named witnesses could still be found. The letter had been placed in the wall by the dates it cited in the late summer of 1868. That was 19 years past. A Mason's witnesses would have been working men in the territory, men of middle age or older at the time. Some would be dead. Some might have moved on. One, the letter said, had been a neighbor who had seen both the original agreement regarding the land grant being discussed and had later been present when Vargas met with the first sheriff on the occasion, when the sheriff made clear that the $43 would not be forthcoming. A neighbor was a thing that could be traced through property records if the records held. She wrote the witness names on a separate sheet and set it aside. The letter itself she returned to the tin box and closed the hasp. The receipt with the blank payer's line she held for a while longer. Pratt had shown her receipts in the Socorro records before, instruments prepared by one party and never countersigned by the other. and he had explained that such a receipt was legally significant in ways that varied by jurisdiction. The receipt in the tin box was significant regardless of jurisdiction. It established that Vargas had expected payment, had been precise about the amount, had gone so far as to prepare the full instrument. A man does not prepare a receipt and then decline to collect. The empty line was its own kind of statement, and it had been waiting 19 years for someone to read it correctly. She fell asleep at the table with the lamp still burning and woke to find the flame sputtering in an empty reservoir. Eli Soto, when she returned to Socorro and described what she had found in the cell, was quiet for a time. In the particular way he was quiet when information arrived that organized other information he had held for a long time, without a place for it. He said, after the silence, that he had wondered about the jailhouse sale for a different reason than most people. He said he had wondered whether Harlan Greer knew what was in the title. She asked him what he thought. Eli looked at his desk for a moment. "A man who sells a building for $1, he said finally, either does not know what he owns or does not want it anymore. She asked whether he had known Harlan Greer personally. Eli said he had encountered him twice at the county office on matter of record transfers, and that Greer had struck him as a man of average attentiveness, not a student of documents, but not so careless as to sell 11 years of his life for $1 without knowing something of what that meant. Eli said he did not think the dollar was indifference. He thought the dollar was a man stepping away from a debt he could not discharge. She asked him how he had known about the covenant. Eli said it had come across his desk when the jailhouse was originally recorded, and that he had made a notation in his own file of the amendment in the different hand, because instruments amended in a different hand always required a separate notation. He had never been asked about it. In 32 years of recorder work, he said, no one had come to him asking about the Cobre Flats jailhouse deed covenant. Not once. That was the kind of information that sat in a filing cabinet for decades, he said, and either rotted there or waited for the right question. She considered both possibilities in the days that followed while she worked through the territorial archive in Socorro, looking for the administrative proceeding that had revoked Aurelio Vargas's land grant in 1868. The proceeding was there, as Eli had described, and the sworn statement was there, signed by the first sheriff, and behind it, filed in the same folder and apparently overlooked by every person who had touched that folder in the intervening years, was a counter-statement. The counter-statement was signed by 3 witnesses and bore a date 2 weeks after the sheriff's original sworn statement. It said, in plain language, that Aurelio Vargas had not abandoned the parcel, that he had been present in the territory on the date the first sheriff swore he had departed, and that the revocation of the land grant was grounded in a false record. The counter-statement had never been processed. It had been received by the clerk's office, stamped with an intake date, and filed in the same folder as the original sworn statement, without any notation that it had been reviewed, referred, or acted upon by anyone at any time. It had sat there for 19 years. Nora placed both statements side by side on the table in the archive reading room and spent a long while looking at them. The counter-statement carried 3 signatures. The first 2 names she did not recognize. The third was familiar to her from the Cobre Flats deed records. A man who had owned and operated the only hardware store in town from 1863 until his death in the spring of 1889. He had died 2 months before Harlan Greer sold the jailhouse for $1. She thought about that sequence of events for some time. She thought about what it meant for a man to sign a counterstatement in good faith in 1868, and then spend 20 years in the same town as the sheriff who had filed the false original, watching the matter remain unresolved, watching the land stay in the county's hands, watching the man who had cut the stone for sell for diminish and eventually disappear from the territory. She thought about what it might feel like, toward the end of one's life, to want to give that particular piece of unfinished business to someone who could still act on it. The man's widow, a woman named Frances Udell, who was 71 years old and still lived in the house behind the hardware store building, received Nora on a Wednesday afternoon in late August. Frances was a precise woman with white hair, pinned back, and the manner of someone who had listened carefully to a great many things over a long life, without being asked her opinion of them very often. Nora did not offer opinions. She laid out the counter-statement on the table between them and indicated her late husband's signature. Frances looked at the document for a moment and then looked out the window. She said, in a flat, even voice, that her husband had told her about that statement years ago. He had signed it because he had seen Aurelio Vargas in the territory 2 weeks after the first sheriff swore the man was gone, had spoken to him, had shaken his hand at the hardware counter, and sold him a set of masonry chisels. He had gone to the clerk's office to correct the record. He had expected the counter-statement to settle the matter. When nothing happened, he had made further inquiry and been told the matter had been resolved. He had believed that because the clerk had said it with the certainty of a man whose records were in order. He had carried some unease about the episode for years, but saw no next step available to a hardware man with no legal standing and no documentation beyond his own word. Frances paused there and folded her hands on the table. She said that Harlan Greer had come to visit her husband in the final weeks before his death, which had not been unusual. They had been neighbors for many years, and Greer was a man who visited the sick. On one of those visits, she had heard her husband's voice from the bedroom, speaking at some length, more than he had managed in the preceding days. His tone, the particular tone of a man unburdening himself of something that had been sitting with him too long. Greer had come out of the room afterward looking as though he had been told something he had not wanted to know. She did not know what they had spoken about. Her husband had not said. The land itself and the question of its ownership were the matter Nora brought to a territory attorney in Santa Fe, whose practice handled title disputes and whose fee was arranged on a contingency against the value of the parcel if the claim was validated. The attorney, whose name was Carver, was a methodical man who read documents without expression and then expressed himself in plain declarative sentences. He read the original land grant, the revocation, the counterstatement, the covenant on the deed, the letter from the tin box, and the unsigned receipt. He was quiet for a time after that. He said the counterstatement alone was probably not sufficient to restore the grant. A single counterstatement filed in good faith but never processed, he explained, left the revocation technically standing, and challenging a standing administrative proceeding on a counterstatement alone was a difficult argument to make in the territory court, particularly after 2 decades. The court had seen litigants attempt to unseat old proceedings on the basis of filed but unprocessed instruments before, and the judges were not inclined to treat the recorder's inaction as dispositive. What changed the weight of the argument was the letter and the physical circumstances of how it had been preserved. A written statement from the aggrieved party, placed inside the property itself, contemporaneous with the events it described, and sealed in a manner that could not reasonably be attributed to later fabrication, was a different kind of evidence from a counterstatement in a folder. Combined with the covenant, the unsigned receipt, and the physical evidence of the cavity and the tin box, the argument was material and specific. The challenge could be brought on behalf of Vargas's heirs, assuming a living heir could be established. He asked whether Nora had found one. She had searched the parish death records in Albuquerque and the census materials she could access from the territory recorder's office. Aurelio Vargas had died in 1881 in Albuquerque, according to the parish register, without having recovered the land. He had left a daughter, Rosa, who had survived him. Rosa Vargas had married in 1884 and was living, as of the most recent census return Nora could locate, in the town of Las Cruces. Her married name was Rosa Delgado. Rosa Delgado was 41 years old when Nora appeared at her door in September of 1887. She was a compact, deliberate woman who opened the door and looked at Nora without speaking, with the expression of someone who has learned that cautiousness is the most reliable stance available to a person who has not been given many reasons to expect good news at her door. Nora did not try to reassure her with her face or her voice. She asked simply if she might come in and show her some documents. She sat at Rosa's kitchen table and laid out the papers in the order in which they spoke to each other. The land grant first, then the revocation, then the counterstatement, then the covenant, then the letter from the tin box, and last of all, the unsigned receipt. She explained each one briefly and without embellishment, the way Pratt had taught her to explain instruments, by describing what was written rather than offering an interpretation of what it meant to have been written. When she was done, she set the tin dispatch box on the table and opened the hasp so that Rosa could see the letter sitting in it, folded as her father had folded it. Rosa picked up the letter and read it. She read it again. She set it down and placed her hand flat on the table beside it and looked at the window for a long time. She said, in a voice that had most of its feeling held somewhere behind the words, that her father had told her the land was gone, that it was gone and there was nothing to be done, that he had tried. Nora said that he had left a record inside the stone because he did not trust that the paper record would survive. Rosa said nothing to that. She looked at the letter again. There are things that cannot be restored, and there are things that can. What Aurelio Vargas had lost in the years between 1868 and his death in 1881 included not only the land itself and the $43, but the decades in which those 40 acres and that water might have built something substantial for his daughter and for her children after her. Those years were not recoverable. Nora knew that, and she did not construct any phrase that suggested otherwise. She had not come to offer comfort. She had come to show Rosa what her father had preserved and what remained possible on the basis of it. What remained possible was the restoration of the title to the land, if the attorney's argument held in the territory court, and the payment of the $43 owed under the covenant. The covenant, as Carver had noted, transferred cleanly to the heirs of the original creditor. Nora, as the new owner of the property, was both the party obligated to honor it and the party in a position to ensure it was honored, which was a legal symmetry she had found satisfying from the moment she understood it clearly. Rosa sat with the documents for a time longer, not reading them with the same attention now, but keeping her hands near them. Nora waited. She had learned from Pratt that certain transactions require the other party to arrive at readiness on their own, and that the way to recognize readiness is to watch the hands rather than the face. Rosa's hands eventually stilled. She looked at Nora directly. She asked if it was likely to succeed. Nora said she couldn't make a promise on that score, but that the attorney in Santa Fe had agreed to take the case on contingency, which was his own assessment of its merits. Rosa said she would like to go forward. The question of Harlan Greer resolved itself more quietly than Nora had expected. She did not seek him out with an accusation, because an accusation was not what the documents required of her and not what she had the standing to deliver. The documents required a legal proceeding, and Carver filed the necessary instruments in October of 1887. What the proceeding required from Greer was nothing, because he had not been the sheriff in 1868 and was not named as a party in the revocation or the covenant or the letter. He appeared in the chain of events only as the man who had sold a building with a live covenant attached to its title at a price that did not suggest confidence in a clean sale. Whether he had known and how much he had known was never established to her satisfaction. Eli Soto's framing remained the one she returned to in her private thinking, that a man who sells a building for $1 either does not know what he owns or does not want it anymore. She believed Greer had understood something, had understood it in that half-awake way a person understands a thing they have inherited from their predecessor without having done it themselves, who has lived above a debt for 11 years without fully examining its terms. Udell, dying in the spring, had told him something. What he had been told had been enough to make him leave. It was enough, at any rate, to make a man walk away from the only home he had for $1 on a Tuesday morning in July. The land grant restoration took 14 months through the territory court. The argument Carver brought relied on the counterstatement as evidence of a false record, corroborated by the letter's specific dates and name witnesses and by the physical circumstances of how and where the letter had been preserved. The territory court agreed with the argument in its essential parts and voided the 1868 revocation. The title to the 40 acres was conveyed to Rosa Delgado in December of 1888. The land wasn't farmland in the ordinary sense, being rocky and dry in its upper portions. Its lower edge ran along a seasonal creek that Rosa's father had understood to carry reliable water rights that predated the town's own water claims. Rosa's husband, who had been working a parcel adjacent to the recovered land, said when the papers arrived that his wife had always told him the 40 acres would come back eventually. He did not say why she had believed that. Nora paid the $43 herself from a fee Carver had arranged for her document work on the case. It wasn't a large amount. She recorded the payment against the covenant before she closed the matter out of her own files. The unsigned receipt she had found in the tin box she completed in her own hand on the payer's line and filed it with the land records in the Socorro recorder's office, where Eli Soto stamped it with an intake date and filed it in the correct folder without comment, in the efficient and unhurried manner that was his professional signature. The jailhouse in Cobrae Flats was sold a second time, several years later at a price that reflected the market for useful stone structures in a growing territory. The dressed stonework on the eastern wall was noted in the sale inventory as being of exceptional quality, built in a style and to a standard that the other 3 walls did not match. The mason's name did not appear in the inventory. It was in the county land records, and in the deed covenant, and in a letter that had waited inside a pivot-set stone for 18 years to be found by someone who knew how to look for it. Rosa kept the tin box on a shelf in her kitchen, above the window that faced west toward the recovered parcel. The clasp was left unlatched. The letter was inside it, folded as her father had folded it. The paper was old enough now to feel fragile at its creases, though the ink had held and the hand remained legible and careful. The hand of a man who had been very precise about what he left behind and where he left it. The unsigned receipt was also inside, the payer's line no longer blank, filed and then returned to the box because Rosa had asked that it be returned. She had said simply that she wanted it near the letter. Nora had thought that was the right thing to want. Nora had kept nothing from the cell except the knowledge of what the stone had contained and the habit of the work itself, the slow, attentive pressure of the knife spine in the joint, the moment of resistance before the give. The recognition that the gap between what a record shows and what it conceals is almost always where the real information lives. Gideon Pratt had given her that habit. She had been carrying it for 4 years when she walked into the Cobra Flats jailhouse and found that it was what the moment required. Read what is written, not what they meant to write, he had told her. She had read what was written in the deed, and then in the covenant, and then in the stone, and then in the letter, and then in the receipt waiting 19 years for a signature it had never received. Each document had said what it said, plainly to anyone willing to attend to it. The building had stood on a debt for 18 years. It had taken a woman with a leather satchel and a clasp knife and the patience to probe a joint to say that the debt was ready to be settled. There are things in this world that hold their shape for a long time, in places no one thinks to look. A pivot set block in a dressed stone wall. A counter statement in a folder behind the instrument it was meant to correct. A receipt with a blank line. Waiting. They hold their shape because someone put them there carefully, expecting that the right person would come along and know what to do with them. In this case, the right person did. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. There are more buried things in the Frontier record, and the next story waiting is not far.